Section 3. Competition and Monopoly. The good side of competition. Quote, competition is as essential to labor as division. It is necessary to the advent of equality. End quote. The bad side of competition. Quote, this principle is the negation of itself. Its most certain effect is to ruin those whom it draws into its train. End quote. General reflection. Quote, the inconveniences which follow in its train, as well as the good which it procures, flow logically the one and the other from the principle. End quote. Problem to solve. Quote, to find the principle of reconciliation, which must be derived from a law superior to liberty itself. End quote. Variant. Quote, it cannot therefore be here a question of destroying competition, a thing as impossible as to destroy liberty itself. It is a question of finding the equilibrium, I will frankly say, the police. End quote. Mr. Proudhon begins by defending the eternal necessity of competition against those who would replace it by emulation. There is no emulation without an object. And as, quote, the object of every passion is necessarily analogous to the passion, a mistress for the lover, power for the ambitious, gold for the avaricious, a crown for the poet, the object of industrial emulation is necessarily profit. Emulation is nothing but competition itself. End quote. Competition is emulation in view of profit. Is industrial emulation necessarily emulation in view of profit? That is to say, competition? Mr. Proudhon proves it in affirming it. We have already seen that to affirm is, for him, to prove, the same as to suppose is to deny. If the immediate object of the lover is a mistress, the immediate object of industrial emulation is the product and not the profit. Competition is not industrial emulation. It is commercial emulation. In our days, industrial emulation only exists in view of commerce. There are some phases in the economic life of modern peoples in which everybody is seized with a kind of vertigo for making profit without producing. This vertigo of speculation, which reappears periodically, discloses the real character of competition, which seeks to escape the necessity of industrial emulation. If you had told an artisan of the 14th century that the privileges and the whole feudal organization of industry were about to be abrogated in order to put industrial emulation, called competition, in their place, he would have answered that the privileges of the various corporations, masters and wardens, were organized competition. Mr. Proudhon says no better in affirming that emulation is nothing but competition itself. Quote, enact that from January 1st, 1847, work and wages shall be guaranteed to everybody. Immediately, an immense relaxation would succeed to the ardent tension of industry. End quote. In the place of a supposition, an affirmation, and a negation, we have now an ordinance, which Mr. Proudhon gives expressly in order to prove the necessity of competition, its eternity as a category, etc. If people were to suppose that it only requires an ordinance to escape from competition, they would never escape from it. And to go so far as to propose the abolition of competition while retaining the wage system is to propose to make nonsense by a royal decree. But the peoples do not proceed by royal decree. Before making these ordinances, they have at least to change, from top to bottom, their industrial and political conditions of existence, and, in consequence, all their manner of being. Mr. Proudhon would answer with his imperturbable assurance that this is the hypothesis, quote, of a transformation of our nature without historical precedent, end quote, and that he would have the right to, quote, put us outside the discussion, end quote. In virtue of we know not what ordinance. Mr. Proudhon does not know that the whole of history is nothing but a continual transformation of human nature. Quote, let us keep to facts. The French Revolution was made for industrial as well as for political liberty. And, although France, in 1789, may not have recognized all the consequences of the principle, the realization of which she demanded, we may say frankly she was not deceived either in her desires or in her attempt. Whoever should attempt to deny this would, in my opinion, lose the right of criticism. I will never dispute with an adversary who would lay down as a principle that 25 million of men had spontaneously been guilty of error. Why then, if competition were not a principle of the social economy, a decree of destiny, a necessity of the human mind, why, instead of abolishing corporations, companies, and warrenships, did not people rather think of re-establishing the whole of them?" End quote. Thus, since the French people of the 18th century abolished corporations, companies, and warrenships instead of modifying them, the French people of the 19th century ought to modify competition instead of abolishing it. Since competition was established in France in the 18th century as a consequence of historical needs, the competition must not be destroyed in the 19th century in consequence of other historical needs. Mr. Proudhon, not comprehending that the establishment of competition was bound up with the actual development of the men of the 18th century, makes of competition a necessity of the human mind, in partibus infidelium. What would he have made of the great Colbert for the 17th century? After the Revolution comes the existing state of things. Mr. Proudhon also draws some facts from that in order to show the eternity of competition, by proving that all the industries in which this category is not yet sufficiently developed, as agriculture, are in a state of inferiority or decay. To say that there are some industries which are not yet at the height of competition, that yet others are below the level of bourgeois production, is mere quibbling, which by no means proves the eternity of competition. All the logic of Mr. Proudhon is summed up in this: competition is a social relation in which we really develop our productive forces. He gives to this truth not any logical developments, but certain forms, often well developed, in saying that competition is industrial emulation, the actual mode of being free, responsibility and labor, the constitution of value, a necessary condition for the future of equality, a principle of social economy, a decree of destiny, a necessity of the human mind, an inspiration of eternal justice, liberty in division, division in liberty, an economic category. Quote, competition and association support each other. So far from excluding each other, they are not even divergent. Who speaks of competition already supposes a common end. Competition, therefore, is not egoism, and the most deplorable error of socialism lay in having regarded it as the overthrow of society. End quote. Who speaks of competition speaks of a common end, and that proves, on the one hand, that competition is association, on the other, that competition is not egoism. And does not he who speaks of egoism speak of a common end? Each egoism operates in society and by reason of the existence of society. It, therefore, presupposes society, that is to say, common ends, common wants, common means of production, etc., etc. Can it by chance be that, therefore, the competition of the association of which the socialists speak are not even divergent? The socialists know very well that modern society is based upon competition. How can they reproach competition with overthrowing the existing society which they desire to overthrow themselves? And how can they reproach competition with the overthrow of the society of the future in which, on the contrary, they see the overthrow of competition? Mr. Proudhon says, further, that competition is the opposite of monopoly, that, in consequence, it cannot be the opposite of association. Feudalism was, from its origin, opposed to competition, which did not yet exist. Did it follow that competition was not opposed to feudalism? In fact, society, association, are denominations which may be given to all societies, to feudal society as well as to bourgeois society, which is association based upon competition. How, then, can there be socialists who, by the single word association, think to be able to dispose of competition? And how can Mr. Proudhon himself think to defend competition against socialism, simply by defining competition by the single word association? All that we have just considered forms the good side of competition, as Mr. Proudhon understands it. We will now pass on to the evil side, that is to say, to the negative side of competition, to its inconveniences, to those qualities in it which are destructive, subversive, maleficent. The picture of these which Mr. Proudhon presents to us is a somewhat lugubrious one. Competition engenders poverty, foments civil war. It changes the natural zones, confounds nationalities, disturbs families, corrupts the public conscience, overturns the notions of equity, of justice, of morality, And what is worse, it destroys honest and free commerce and does not give, in exchange, synthetical value, fixed and honest price. It disenchants everybody, even the economists. It forces things on even to its own destruction. After all the bad that Mr. Proudhon says of it, can there be, for the relations of bourgeois society, for its principles and its illusions, an element more disintegrating, more destructive than competition? Let us observe that competition always becomes more destructive of bourgeois relations in proportion as it excites to a feverish creation of new productive forces, that is to say, of the material conditions of a new society. In this connection, at least, the evil side of competition should have its good. Quote, competition as an economic position or phase, considered in its origin, is the necessary result of the theory of the reduction of the general cost. End quote. For Mr. Proudhon, the circulation of the blood must be a consequence of the theory of Harvey. Quote, monopoly is the fatal term of competition, which the latter engenders by an incessant negation of itself. This generation of monopoly is already the justification of competition. Monopoly is the natural opposite of competition. But from the time that competition is necessary, it applies the idea of monopoly, since monopoly is as the seat of each competing individuality. End quote. We rejoice with Mr. Proudhon that he can for once, at least, properly apply his formula of thesis and antithesis. Everybody knows that modern monopoly is engendered by competition. As to the content, Mr. Proudhon devotes himself to some poetic images. Competition makes, quote, of each subdivision of labor a sort of sovereignty, in which each individual reposes in his strength and his independence. End quote. Monopoly is, quote, the seat of each competing individuality. End quote. The sovereignty is at least worthy of the seat. Mr. Proudhon speaks only of modern monopoly engendered by competition. But we all know that competition was engendered by feudal monopoly. Thus, primarily competition has been the contrary of monopoly, and not monopoly the contrary of competition. Therefore, modern monopoly is not a simple antithesis. It is, on the contrary, a true synthesis. Thesis: feudal monopoly anterior to competition. Antithesis: competition. Synthesis: modern monopoly, which is the negation of feudal monopoly insofar as it supposes the regime of competition, and which is the negation of competition insofar as it is the monopoly. Thus modern monopoly, bourgeois monopoly, is synthetic monopoly, the negation of the negation, the unity of contraries. It is monopoly in its pure, normal, rational state. Mr. Proudhon is in contradiction with his own philosophy when he makes of bourgeois monopoly monopoly in the crude, simple, contradictory, spasmodic state. Mr. Rosy, whom Mr. Proudhon often quotes on the subject of monopoly, appears to have more clearly grasped the synthetic character of bourgeois monopoly. In his Cours d'économie politique, he distinguishes between artificial monopolies and natural monopolies. Feudal monopolies, he says, are artificial, that is to say, arbitrary. Bourgeois monopolies are natural, that is to say, rational. Monopoly is a good thing, reasons Mr. Proudhon, since it is an economic category, an emanation from the impersonal reason of humanity. Competition is another good thing, since it also is an economic category. But what is not good is the reality of monopoly and the reality of competition. What is worse still is that competition and monopoly devour each other mutually. What is to be done? Seek the synthesis of these two eternal thoughts, drag it from the bosom of God, where it has been deposited from time immemorial. In practical life, we find not only competition, monopoly, and their antagonism, but also their synthesis, which is not a formula, but a movement. Monopoly produces competition, competition produces monopoly. The monopolists are made by competition. The competitors become monopolists. If the monopolists restrict competition among themselves by partial association, competition grows among the workers, and the more the mass of the workers grows as against the monopolists of one nation, the more keen becomes the competition between the monopolists of different nations. The synthesis is such that monopoly can only maintain itself by continually passing through the struggle of competition. In order to dialectically engender the imposts which follow monopoly, Mr. Proudhon talks to us of the social genius who, after having intrepidly pursued his zigzag route, quote, after having marched with a firm step, without regret and without halting, and having arrived at the angle of monopoly, casts a melancholy glance backward, and, after profound reflection, fixes imposts on all objects of production, and creates an entire administrative organization, in order that all employment should be delivered to the proletariat, and be paid by the men of monopoly. End quote. What is to be said of this genius, who being fasting walks zigzag? And what is to be said of this promenade, which has no other end than to demolish the bourgeoisie by imposts, while these imposts serve precisely to give the bourgeoisie the means of conserving its position as the dominant class? In order to get a glimpse of the manner in which Mr. Proudhon treats economic details, it will suffice to say that, according to him, the impost on articles of consumption must have been established with a view to equality, and in order to render assistance to the proletariat. Imposts on articles of consumption have only had their true development since the advent of the bourgeoisie, in the hands of industrial capital, and that is to say, the sober and thrifty wealth which maintained, reproduced, and increased itself by the direct exploitation of labor. The impost on articles of consumption was a means of exploiting the frivolous, joyous, prodigal wealth of the grand lords who did nothing but consume. Sir James Stewart very well explains this primitive object of the imposts on articles of consumption in his Inquiry into the Principles of Political Economy, which he published 10 years before Adam Smith. Quote, under the pure monarchy, he says, the prince seems jealous, as it were, of growing wealth, and therefore imposes taxes upon people who are growing richer. Under the limited government, they are calculated chiefly to affect those who are growing poorer. Thus the monarch imposes a tax upon industry, where every one is rated in proportion to the gain he is supposed to make by his profession. The poll tax and taille are likewise proportioned to the supposed opulence of everyone liable to them. In limited governments, impositions are generally laid upon consumption. End quote. As to the logical succession of imposts, of the balance of commerce, of credit, in the understanding of Mr. Proudhon, we will merely observe that the English bourgeoisie having, under William of Orange, attained its political constitution, created at a stroke a new system of taxation, public credit, and the system of protective duties, when it was in position to freely develop its conditions of existence. This glimpse will suffice to give the reader a fair idea of the lucubrations of Mr. Proudhon on police and taxation, the balance of commerce, communism, and population. We defy the most indulgent critic to approach these chapters seriously. Section 4. Property and Rent. In each historical epoch, property is differently developed, and in a series of social relations entirely different. Thus, to define bourgeois property is nothing other than to explain all the social relations of bourgeois production. To pretend to give a definition of property as an independent relation, a separate category, an abstract and eternal idea, can only be an illusion of metaphysics or of jurisprudence. Mr. Proudhon, while professing to speak of property in general, deals only with property in land, the rent of land. Quote, the origin of rent as property is, so to speak, extra-economic. It exists in certain psychological and moral considerations which are only remotely connected with the production of wealth. End quote. Volume 2, page 266. Thus, Mr. Proudhon recognizes his inability to comprehend the economic origin of rent and of property. He acknowledges that this incompatibility obliges him to have recourse to psychological and moral considerations, which are indeed only remotely connected with the production of wealth, being closely allied to the exigencies of his historical views. Mr. Proudhon affirms that in the origin of property there is something mystic and mysterious. But to see mystery in the origin of property, that is to say, to transform the relation of production itself to the distribution of the instruments of production into a mystery, is that not, to use the language of Mr. Proudhon, to renounce all pretension to economic science? Mr. Proudhon is, quote, compelled to recall that at the seventh epoch of economic evolution, credit, the fiction having caused the reality to vanish, human activity threatening to lose itself in space, it became necessary to attach it more closely to nature, but rent was the price of this new contract. End quote. Quote, the man with 40 crowns, end quote, represents a Proudhon to come. Quote, my lord the creator, if you please, each is master in his world, but you will never make me believe that this world, where we are, is of glass. End quote. In such a world where credit was a means for losing oneself in space, it is quite possible for property to be necessary in order to attach man to nature. In the world of real people, where property in land always precedes credit, the horror vacui of Mr. Proudhon could not exist. The existence of rent once admitted, whatever may have been its origin, it is contradictorily debated between farmer and landlord. What is the last term of this debate? In other words, what is the mean quota of rent? Here is what Mr. Proudhon says. Quote, the theory of Ricardo answers this question. At the beginning of society, when man, newly arrived on earth, had before him only immense forests, when the earth was vast and industry was in its infancy, rent was nil. Land, not yet cultivated by labor, was an object of utility. It was not a value in exchange. It was common, not social. Little by little, the multiplication of families and the progress of agriculture caused the price of land to make itself felt. Labor gave its value to the soil. From that sprang rent. The more fruitful a field with the same quantity of labor, the more it was esteemed. Moreover, the tendency of the proprietors was always to attribute to themselves the whole of the fruits of the soil, less the wages of the cultivator, that is to say, less the cost of production. Thus property followed in the train of labor to take from it all that which, in the product, exceeded the actual cost. Property fulfilled a mystic duty by representing the community face to face with the cultivator. In the design of Providence, the cultivator is nothing but a responsible laborer, who must give an account to society of all that he reaps in excess of his legitimate wages. By essence and destination, therefore, rent is an instrument of distributive justice, one of the 1,000 means which economic geniuses put into operation in order to arrive at equality. It is an immense valuation executed contradictorily by the landlords and farmers, without the possibility of collision, in a superior interest, and the definite result of which must be to equalize the possession of the land between the exploiters of the soil and the industrial community. It required nothing less than this magic of property to drag from the cultivator the excess of the product, which he could not be prevented from regarding as his, and of which he believed himself to be the sole author. Rent, or rather property, broke down agricultural egoism and created a solidarity to which no power, no partition of the land, could have given birth. At present, the moral effect of property secured, it only remains to distribute the rent. End quote. All this jumble of words may be reduced to this. Ricardo says that the excess of the price of agricultural products over their cost of production, including the ordinary profit and interest of capital, gives the measure of the rent. Mr. Proudhon does better. He makes the proprietor intervene as a deus ex machina, who drags from the cultivator all the excess of his production over the actual cost of production. He makes use of the intervention of the proprietor to explain property, of the landlord to explain rent. He answers the problem by restating the same problem and increasing it by a syllable. We may further observe that in determining rent by the difference of fertility of the soil, Mr. Proudhon assigns to it a new origin, since land, before being estimated according to the different degrees of fertility, was not, according to him, quote, a value in exchange, but was common, end quote. What has it now become? This fiction of rent, which sprang from the necessity of attaching to earth man, who is likely to lose himself in the infinity of space. Let us now extricate the doctrine of Ricardo from the providential, allegorical, and mystical phrases in which Mr. Proudhon has been careful to envelop it. Rent in the Ricardian sense is property in land in the bourgeois state, that is to say, feudal property which has been subjected to the conditions of bourgeois production. We have seen that, according to Ricardo, the price of all products is finally determined by the cost of production, including in that industrial profit, in other terms, by the time of labor employed. In the manufacturing industry, the price of the product obtained by the minimum labor regulates the price of all other commodities of the same kind, provided that the least costly and most productive instruments of production may be multiplied to infinity, and that, therefore, free competition necessarily creates a market price, that is to say, a common price, for all the products of the same kind. In agricultural industry, on the contrary, it is the price of the product obtained by the greatest amount of labor which regulates the price of all the products of the same kind. In the first place, we cannot, as in manufacturing industry, multiply at will the instruments of production of the same degree of productivity, that is to say, the soils of the same degree of fertility. Then, in proportion as population grows, it is necessary to exploit soils of inferior quality, or to expend on the same soil additional capital proportionately less productive than the first. In either case, a larger quantity of labor is expended in order to obtain a product proportionally smaller. The needs of the population having rendered this increase of labor necessary, the product of the soil more costly to cultivate has its sale forced as well as that of the more cheaply cultivated soil. Competition levels the market price, and the product of the better soil will fetch as high a price as that of the inferior soil. It is the excess of the price of the products of the superior soil over the cost of production which constitutes rent. If there were always at disposal soils of the same degree of fertility, if, as in manufacturing industry, recourse could always be had to the less costly and more productive machinery, or if the second expenditure of capital produced as much as the first, then the price of agricultural products would be determined by the price of the commodities produced by the better instruments of production, as we have seen in the price of manufactured articles. But also, from this moment, rent would have disappeared. For the theory of Ricardo to be generally true, it is further necessary that capital could be freely applied to the different branches of industry, that a strongly developed competition between the capitalists should have reduced profits to an equal rate, that the farmer should be no more than an industrial capitalist who asks for the employment of his capital upon the land, a profit equal to that which he would draw from his capital applied to any manufacturer. That agricultural exploitation should be subject to the regime of the great industry. In fine, that the landed proprietor himself should aim at nothing more than the monetary revenue. Rent may no longer exist, as is the case in Ireland, although farming there has been developed to an advanced degree. Rent being the excess, not only over wages, but over the industrial profit, it cannot exist where the revenue of the proprietor is only a previous deduction from wages. But, far from making of the exploiter of the soil, of the farmer, a simple laborer, and, quote, dragging from the peasant the excess of the product which he cannot be prevented from regarding as his own, end quote, rent sets before the landed proprietor the industrial capitalist instead of the slave, the serf, the tributary, the wage worker. Further, a considerable time elapsed before the feudal farmer was replaced by the industrial capitalist. In Germany, for example, this transformation did not begin until the last third of the 18th century. It is only in England that this relation between the industrial capitalist and the landed proprietor has been fully developed. So long as there was only the cultivator of Mr. Proudhon, there was no rent. When there is rent, the peasant is not the farmer, but the workman, the employé of the farmer. The degradation of the cultivator, reduced to the position of simple workman, day laborer, wage worker, laboring for the industrial capitalist, the intervention of the industrial capitalist, exploiting the land like any other factory, the transformation of the landed proprietor from a petty sovereign into a vulgar usurer. Those are the different relations expressed by rent. Rent, in the Ricardian sense, is a patriarchal agriculture transformed into commercial industry, industrial capital applied to the land, the bourgeoisie of the towns transplanted into the country. Rent, instead of attaching man to nature, has only attached the exploitation of the land to competition. Once constituted as rent, landed property itself is the result of competition, since thenceforth it depends upon the saleable value of agricultural products. As rent, landed property is mobilized and becomes an effect of commerce. Rent is possible only from the moment in which the development of the industry of the towns and the social organization resulting therefrom force the landlord to have regard only to venal profit, to the monetary relation of his agricultural products, to see, in fine, in his landed property only a machine for making money. Rent has so perfectly detached the landed proprietor from the soil, from nature, that he scarcely needs to know his lands, as we see in England. As to the farmer, the industrial capitalist, and the agricultural laborer, they are no more attached to the soil which they cultivate than the capitalist, and the workmen in manufacture are attached to the cotton or the wood they use. They have regard only for the price of their exploitation, for the monetary product. To that fact is due the jeremiads of the reactionary parties who fervently pray for the return of feudalism, for the happy patriarchal life, for the simple and noble manners of our ancestors. The subjugation of the soil to the laws which rule every other industry is and will always be the subject of interested condolences. Thus we might say that rent is the motive force which has cast idealism into the historical movement. Ricardo, after having supposed bourgeois production as necessary in order to determine rent, applies it nevertheless to landed property in every epoch, in every country. These are the errors of all economists who regard the conditions of bourgeois production as eternal categories. From the providential object of rent, which is, for Mr. Proudhon, the transformation of the cultivator into a responsible workman, he goes on to the egalitarian reward of rent. Rent, as we have just seen, is constituted by the equal price of the products of land of unequal fertility, in such wise that a hectoliter of wheat which has costs 10 francs is sold for 20 francs if the cost of production rises, for an inferior soil, to 20 francs. So long as necessity compels the purchase of all the agricultural products put upon the market price is determined by the highest cost of production. It is, therefore, this equalization of price, resulting from competition and not from different fertility of soils, which secures for the proprietor of the superior soil a rent of 10 francs for each hectoliter, which his farmer sells. Let us for a moment suppose that the price of the wheat is determined by the labor time necessary to produce it, and that in consequence the hectoliter of wheat obtained from the superior soil would be sold at 10 francs, while that obtained from the inferior soil would cost 20. That admitted, the mean market price would be 15 francs, while, according to the law of competition, it is 20 francs. If the mean price was 15 francs, there would be nothing for distribution, either equalitarian or other, as there would be no rent. Rent exists only in consequence of the fact that the hectoliter of wheat, which cost the producer 10 francs, is sold for 20 francs. Mr. Proudhon supposes the equality of the market price, with unequal cost of production, in order to arrive at the egalitarian distribution of the product of inequality. We can understand such economists as Mill, Chabouillet, Hilditch, and others, demanding that rent should be handed over to the state to be used for the remission of taxation. That is only the frank expression of the hate which the industrial capitalist feels for the landed proprietor, who appears to him as a useless encumbrance, a superfluity in the otherwise harmonious whole of bourgeois production. But to first take 20 francs for the hectoliter of wheat in order to afterwards make a general distribution of the 10 francs too much charge to the consumers, that would indeed be sufficient to make the social genius pursue its zigzag way in melancholy, ready to knock its head against any corner. Rent becomes, under the pen of Mr. Proudhon, quote, an immense land valuation made independently by the landlords and the farmers in a superior interest, the definite result of which must be to equalize the possession of the land between the exploiters of the soil and the manufacturing classes. End quote. In order for any valuation whatever, determined by rent, to be of practical utility, it is necessary always to remain in the conditions of existing society. But we have demonstrated that the farm rent, paid by the farmer to the landlord, expresses almost exactly the rent only in those countries most advanced in industry and commerce. Yet this farm rent often includes the interest paid to the landlord for the capital incorporated in the land. The situation of soils, the neighborhood of towns, and very many other circumstances influence the farm hire and modify the rent. These arbitrary reasons will suffice to prove the inexactitude of a land valuation based on rent. On the other hand, rent cannot be a constant indication of the degree of fertility of any land, since the modern application of chemistry constantly changes the nature of the soil, while it is only in recent years that geological knowledge has begun to destroy all the old estimate of relative fertility. It is only about 20 years ago that the vast areas in the eastern countries of England were brought into cultivation. They had been left uncultivated for want of appreciating correctly the relations between the nature of the upper soil and of the lower stratum. Thus history, so far from giving, in rent, a valuation completely formed, simply changes, completely reverses, the valuations already formed. In fine, fertility is not so much a natural quality as might reasonably be supposed, but is intimately related to existing social conditions. A soil may be very fertile for the raising of corn, yet nevertheless the state of the market may induce the cultivator to turn it into an artificial prairie and thus render it barren. Mr. Proudhon has improvised his valuation, which is not even worth the ordinary valuation, simply in order to give a corporeal form to the providentially equalitarian object of rent. Quote, "Rent," continues Mr. Proudhon, "is the interest paid for a capital which never perishes, namely land. And as this capital is not susceptible of any increase as to its material, but only to an indefinite improvement in its use, it results that, while the interest or profit on a loan, mutuum, tends to constantly diminish in consequence of the abundance of capital, rent tends to constantly increase by the perfection of the industry, from which results the improvement in the usages of the soil. Such, in its essence, is rent." End quote. Volume 2, page 265. This time, Mr. Proudhon sees in rent all the attributes of interest, so far as it arises from a capital of a specific nature. This capital is land, eternal capital, quote, "which is not susceptible of any increase as to its material, but only to an indefinite improvement in its use." End quote. In the progressive march of civilization, interest has a constant tendency to fall, while rent constantly tends to rise. Interest falls on account of the abundance of capital. Rent rises with the improvements made in industry, which have the effect of constantly improving the use of land. Such is, in its essence, the opinion of Mr. Proudhon. Let us begin by examining at what point it is correct to say that the rent is the interest on capital. For the landowner himself, rent represents interest on the capital which the land has cost him, or which it would return to him if he sold it. But in buying or selling land, he only buys or sells rent. The price which he has paid in order to acquire the rent is regulated by the general rate of interest, and has nothing to do with the nature of rent itself. The interest on capital invested in land is, in general, less than the interest on capital sunk in manufacture or commerce. Thus, for him who does not distinguish the interest which land represents to the proprietor from rent itself, the interest on capital in land diminishes much more than the interest on other capitals. But it is not here a question of the price of the sale or purchase of rent, of the saleable value of rent, of capitalized rent. It is a question of rent itself. The hire of a farm may imply, in addition to the rent properly so called, interest on capital incorporated in the land. Then, the proprietor receives this part of the farm hire not as landlord, but as capitalist. That is, however, not the rent, properly speaking, with which we have to deal. Land, so long as it is not exploited as a means of production, is not capital. Capital in land can be augmented as well as all other means of production. Nothing is added to the material, to speak the language of Mr. Proudhon, but the soils which serve as instruments of production are multiplied. By merely applying additional capital to land already transformed into means of production, land capital may be augmented without adding anything to the material land, that is to say, to the extent of the land. The material land of Mr. Proudhon has the bounds of the earth for its limits. As to the eternity which he attributes to land, we readily grant that, as matter, it has this quality. As capital, land is not more eternal than any other capital. Gold and silver which pay interest are as durable and eternal as land. If the price of gold and silver falls while that of land rises, that is certainly not due to the more or less eternal nature of land. Land capital is a fixed capital. but fixed capital is used up as well as circulating capital. The improvements effected in the soil need to be reproduced and maintained. They only last a certain time, a quality which they possess in common with all other improvements of which use is made in order to transform matter into means of production. If land capital were eternal, certain lands would present an entirely different aspect to that which they bear today, and we should see the Roman Campagna, Sicily, and Palestine in all the splendor of their ancient prosperity. There are, moreover, cases where land capital may disappear, even while the improvements remain incorporated in the land. In the first place, this actually happens every time that rent, properly so called, is extinguished by the competition of new and more fertile soils. Further, the improvements which have a value at a certain period cease to have that value from the moment that they become universal through the development of agricultural science. The representative of land capital is not the land owner, but the farmer. The revenue which land gives as capital is industrial interest and profit, and not rent. There are some lands which return this interest and profit, but which pay no rent. To sum up, land insofar as it gives interest is land capital, and as land capital it returns no rent. It does not constitute landed property. Rent results from the social relations in which exploitation is carried on. It cannot result from the nature, more or less fixed, more or less durable, of land. Rent proceeds from society and not from the soil. According to Mr. Proudhon, the improvement in the use of land, a result of the improvement of industry, is the cause of the constant rise of rent. This improvement, on the contrary, causes it to periodically fall. In what, in general, does all improvement consist, whether it be in agriculture or in manufacture? It is to produce more with the same amount of labor. It is to produce as much or even more with less labor. Thanks to these improvements, the farmer can dispense with the employment of a greater quantity of labor for a product proportionally less. He has no need, then, to have recourse to the inferior soils, and the portions of capital successively applied to the same land are equally productive. Therefore, these improvements, so far from causing a constant rise of rent, as Mr. Proudhon says, are, on the contrary, so many temporary obstacles which oppose its rise. The English landowners of the 17th century were so sensible in this truth that they strenuously opposed all agricultural progress, for fear of seeing their revenues diminish. See Petty, an English economist of the time of Charles II. Section 5. Strikes and the Combination of Workmen. Quote, every upward movement in wages can have no other effect than that of a rise in wheat, in wine, etc. That is to say, the effect produced by a dearth. For what are wages? They are the cost price of wheat, etc., the integral price of everything. Let us go further still. Wages are the proportion of the elements which compose wealth and which are consumed reproductively each day by the mass of the workers. But to double wages is to bestow upon each of the producers a part greater than his product, which is contradictory, and if the rise only affects a small number of industries, the result is to provoke a general perturbation in exchanges, in a word, a scarcity. It is impossible, I insist, for the strikes which result in an increase in wages not to lead to a general dearness. That is as certain as that 2 and 2 make 4. End quote. Proudhon, Volume 1, page 110 and 111. We deny all these assertions, except that 2 and 2 make 4. In the first place, there is no such thing as general dearness. If the price of everything is doubled, at the same time as wages, there is no change in prices, there is only a change in terms. Further, a general rise in wages can never produce a dearness, more or less general, of commodities. In effect, if all industries employed the same number of workmen in proportion to the fixed capital or to the instruments used, a general rise in wages would produce a general reduction of profits, and the current price of commodities would undergo no alteration. But as the relation of manual labor to fixed capital is not the same in different industries, all the industries which employ relatively a greater mass of fixed capital and less workers will be forced sooner or later to reduce the prices of their commodities. In the contrary case, where the price of their commodities is not reduced, the profit will rise above the common rate of profit. The machines are not wage workers. Therefore, the general rise in wages will affect those industries less which, compared with the others, employ more machines than workmen. But as competition always tends to level the rate of profits, those which rise above the ordinary rate can only do so temporarily. Thus, apart from some oscillations, a general rise in wages, so far from resulting, as Mr. Proudhon contends, in a general rise in prices, would result in a partial fall, that is to say, a fall in the current price of the commodities which are manufactured chiefly by machinery. The rise and fall of profit, or wages, merely expresses the proportion in which the capitalists and the workmen participate in the product of a day of labor without, in most cases, influencing the price of the product, but that, quote, the strikes which are followed by an increase in wages lead to a general rise in prices, to a scarcity even, end quote. These are ideas which could only be hatched in the brain of an unintelligible poet. In England, strikes have regularly given rise to invention and to the application of new machinery. Machines were, we might say, the arms which the capitalists used to defeat revolted labor. The self-acting mule, the greatest invention in modern industry, put the revolted hand-spinners out of action. Even when combination and strikes have no other effect than to arouse against them the efforts of mechanical genius, they always exercise an immense influence on the development of industry. Quote, I find, continues Mr. Proudhon, from an article published by Mr. Leon Faucher, September 1845, that for some time English workmen have ceased to form combinations, which is certainly a progress upon which they are to be congratulated. But this improvement in the morality of the workers arises above all from their economic knowledge. It is not upon the manufacturers, cried a working spinner at a meeting at Bolton, that wages depend. In periods of depression, the masters are only, so to speak, the whips with which necessity is armed, and, whether they will or not, they must strike. The regarding principle is the relation between supply and demand, and the masters have not the power. End quote. Quote, well and good, cries Mr. Proudhon. These are well-developed model workmen, etc., etc. The poverty we have here does not exist in England. It cannot cross the channel. End quote. Proudhon, Volume 1, page 261 and 262. Of all the towns in England, Bolton is one in which radicalism is as fully developed as anywhere. Than the workers of Bolton, there are none more revolutionary. During the great agitation in England for the abolition of the Corn Laws, the English manufacturers felt that they would be unable to make head against the landowners except by putting the workers in the front of the fight. But as the interests of the workers were not less opposed to those of the manufacturers than the interests of the manufacturers were opposed to that of the landowners, it was natural to expect that the manufacturers would get the worst of it in the meetings of the workers. But what did the manufacturers do? In order to save appearances, they organized meetings composed in great part of foremen and overseers, of the small number of workmen who were devoted to them, and some friends of commerce, properly so called. When, afterwards, the real working people attempted, as at Bolton and Manchester, to take part in such meetings in order to protest against the factitious demonstrations, they were told that they were ticket meetings, to which no one could be admitted without a ticket, and were refused admission. Nevertheless, the placards advertising the meetings had announced them as public demonstrations. Every time these meetings were held, the capitalist journals gave glowing accounts, with full and detailed reports of the speeches. It goes without saying that these speeches were made by foremen and overseers. The London newspapers gave literal reproductions of these reports. Mr. Proudhon is so unfortunate as to take the foremen and overseers for ordinary workmen, and to urge upon them the advice not to cross the channel. If in 1844 and in 1845 strikes attracted less attention than formerly, it was because 1844 and 1845 were the 2 first years of prosperity which English industry had enjoyed since 1837. Nevertheless, none of the trade unions were dissolved. Let us now hear the foremen and overseers of Bolton. According to them, the manufacturers are not the masters of wages, because they are not masters of the price of the product, and they are not masters of the world market. By this argument, they gave it to be understood that combinations were not necessary to drag from the masters an increase of wages. Mr. Proudhon, on the contrary, forbids them to combine for fear that combination would be followed by a raise in wages, which would bring in its train a general scarcity. It is not necessary for us to point out that on one point there is perfect agreement between the foreman and Mr. Proudhon, that is, that a rise in wages is the equivalent of a rise in the price of products. But is the fear of a scarcity the true cause of Mr. Proudhon's ill will towards combination? No. He cordially agrees with the foreman of Bolton because they determine value by supply and demand, and because they scarcely think of constituted value, of value passed to the state of constitution, of the constitution of value, comprising the permanent exchangeability and all the other proportionalities of relations and relations of proportionalities, flanked by providence. Quote, "For workers to strike is illegal, and it is not only the penal code which says so, it is the economic system. It is the necessity of the established order, that each workman should have the free disposal of his hands and of his person that can be tolerated, but that workmen should undertake by combination to do violence to monopoly. That is what society can never permit." End quote. Volume 1, page 235 and 237. Mr. Proudhon wishes to make an article of the penal code pass for a necessary and general result of bourgeois production. In England, trade combination is permitted by law, and it is the economic system which has forced Parliament to give this legal authorization. In 1825, when under the Minister Huskisson, Parliament had to modify the law in order to bring it more into accord with a state of things resulting from free competition. It was necessary to abolish the laws which prohibited the combination of workmen. The more modern industry and competition developed, the more elements are there which provoke and support competition, and as soon as combinations have become an economic fact, acquiring greater consistency day by day, they will not be slow in becoming a legal fact. Thus the article of the penal code only proves at most that modern industry and competition were not sufficiently developed under the Constituent Assembly and under the Empire for the legal recognition of combination. The economists and the socialists are agreed on one point, that is, in condemning combinations. Only they have different motives for their act of condemnation. The economists say to the workers, do not combine. By combining you hinder the steady progress of industry, you prevent the manufacturers from executing their orders, you disturb commerce and precipitate the introduction of machinery, which, by rendering your labor in part useless, forces you to accept still lower wages. Otherwise, you may do very well. Your wages will be always determined by the relations between the demand for and the supply of hands, and it is an effort as ridiculous as dangerous to revolt against the eternal laws of political economy. The socialists say to the workers, do not combine, because at the end of the account, what will you have gained by it? An increase of wages? The economists prove to demonstrate that the few pence which you temporarily gain if you succeed will be followed by a lasting reduction. Clever statisticians prove to you that it will take you years to recover by the rise in wages the expenditure you have had to make in order to organize and maintain your combination. And we as socialists tell you that apart from this question of money, you will be not less workmen, and the masters will be always the masters as before. Therefore, no combinations, no politics, for after all, to form combinations is that not having to do with politics? The economists desire that the workers should remain in society as it is formed, and they have recorded and ratified it in their manuals. The socialists desire the workers to leave the old society in order to be the better able to enter into the new society which they have prepared with so much foresight. In spite of the one and the other, in spite of the manuals and the utopias, combinations have not ceased to progress and to grow with the development and growth of modern industry. It is at such a point now that the degree of development of combination in a country marks clearly the degree which that country occupies in the hierarchy of the world market. In England, where industry has attained the highest degree of development, the combinations are the largest and best organized. In England, these combinations are not confined to a partial organization with no other object than a temporary strike, and which will disappear when that is over. Permanent combinations have been formed, trade unions, which serve as a rampart for the workers in their struggle with the capitalists. And at the present time, all these local trade unions have a center or union in the National Association of United Trades, the central committee of which is in London, and which already numbers 80,000 members. The organization of strikes, combinations, trade unions marches simultaneously with the political struggles of the workers, who now constitute a great political party under the name of Chartists. It is under the form of these combinations that the first attempts at association among themselves have always been made by the workers. The great industry masses together in a single place a crowd of people unknown to each other. Competition divides their interests, but the maintenance of their wages, this common interest which they have against their employer, unites them in the same idea of resistance, combination. Thus combination has always a double end, that of eliminating competition among themselves, while enabling them to make a general competition against the capitalist. If the first object of resistance has been merely to maintain wages, in proportion as the capitalists in their turn have combined with the idea of repression, the combinations, at first isolated, have formed in groups, and, in face of constantly united capital, the maintenance of the association became more important and necessary for them than the maintenance of wages. This is so true that the English economists are all astonished at seeing the workers sacrifice a good part of their wages on behalf of the associations, which in the eyes of these economists were only established in support of wages. In this struggle, a veritable civil war, are united and developed all the elements necessary for a future battle. Once arrived at that point, association takes a political character. The economic conditions have in the first place transformed the mass of the people of a country into wage workers. The domination of capital has created for this mass of people a common situation with common interests. Thus the mass is already a class, as opposed to capital, but not yet for itself, in the struggle of which we have only noted some phases. This mass unites. It is constituted as a class for itself. The interests which it defends are the interests of its class. But the struggle between class and class is a political struggle. In the bourgeoisie we have two phases to distinguish: that during which it is constituted as a class under the regime of feudalism and absolute monarchy, and that wherein, already constituted as a class, it overthrew feudalism and monarchy in order to make of society a bourgeois society. The first of these phases was the longest and necessitated the greatest efforts. That also commenced with partial combinations against the feudal lords. Many researches have been made to trace the different historical phases through which the bourgeoisie has passed from the early commune to its constitution as a class. But when it becomes a question of rendering an account of the strikes, combinations, and other forms in which before our eyes the proletarians effect their organization as a class, some are seized with fear while others express a transcendental disdain. An oppressed class is the vital condition of every society based upon the antagonism of classes. The emancipation of the oppressed class therefore necessarily implies the creation of a new society. In order for the oppressed class to be emancipated, it is necessary that the productive powers already acquired and the existing social relations should no longer be able to exist side by side. Of all the instruments of production, the greatest productive power is the revolutionary class itself. The organization of the revolutionary elements as a class supposes the existence of all the productive forces which can be engendered in the bosom of the old society. Is that to say that after the fall of the old society there will be a new class domination comprised in the new political power? No. The essential condition of the emancipation of the working class is the abolition of all classes, as the condition of the emancipation of the third estate of the bourgeois order was the abolition of all estates, all orders. The working class will substitute in the course of its development for the old order of civil society an association which will exclude classes and their antagonism, and there will no longer be political power, properly speaking, since political power is simply the official form of the antagonism in civil society. In the meantime, the antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is a struggle between class and class, a struggle which, carried to its highest expression, is a complete revolution. Would it, moreover, be matter for astonishment if a society, based upon the antagonism of classes, should lead ultimately to a brutal conflict, to a hand-to-hand struggle as its final denouement? Do not say that the social movement excludes the political movement. There has never been a political movement which was not at the same time social. It is only in an order of things in which there will be no longer classes or class antagonism that social evolutions will cease to be political revolutions. Until then, on the eve of each general reconstruction of society, the last word of social science will ever be, quote, le combat ou la mort, la lutte sanguinaire ou la néant. C'est ainsi que la question est invisiblement posée. End quote. George Sand. Fini. Appendix 1. Proudhon judged by Karl Marx. Footnote. Extract from the Social-Démocrate, numbers 16, 17, and 18, January 1865. End of footnote. London, January 24th, 1865. Sir, you ask me for a detailed criticism of the works of Proudhon. I regret that I have not the time to comply with your request. Moreover, I have none of his writings at hand. However, as proof of my goodwill, I will send you these few hasty notes. I do not remember the first essays of Proudhon. His schoolboy work on A Universal Language shows with what recklessness he grappled with problems for the solution of which he lacked the most elementary knowledge. His first work, What is Property, is very much his best. It is an epoch-making book, if not from the novelty of what he said, at least by the freshness and boldness of his manner of putting everything. The French socialists, with whose writings he was acquainted, had naturally not only criticized property from different points of view, but had, in Utopian fashion, suppressed it. In his book, Proudhon is to Saint-Simon and Fourier almost what Feuerbach is to Hegel. Compared with Hegel, Feuerbach is very poor. Nevertheless, after Hegel, he made an epoch, because he accentuated certain points, disagreeable for the Christian conscience and important for philosophic progress, but which had been left by Hegel in an obscure and mystic light. The style of this writing of Proudhon is, if I may say so, bold and vigorous, and it is its style, in my opinion, which is its great merit. We see that even when he merely reproduces, he discovers that what he says is new to him, and that it serves him as something new. The provoking audacity with which he lays hands on the economic sanctuary, the brilliant paradoxes by which he ridicules the dull bourgeois common sense, his incisive criticism, his bitter irony, with here and there a profound and sincere sentiment of revolt against the established order of things, his revolutionary spirit. This it is which electrifies the reader of What is Property, and made the book, on its appearance, a powerful revolutionary impulse. In a rigorously scientific history of political economy, the work would scarcely be worthy of mention. But these sensational books play a part in the sciences as well as in literature. Take, for example, Malthus's Essay on Population. The first edition was simply a sensational pamphlet, and a plagiarism from one end to the other into the bargain. Yet what an impression has this pasquinade produced on humanity. If I had before me this book of Proudhon's, it would be easy for me to give some illustrations of his first style. In the chapters which he himself considers the best, he imitates the contradictory method of Kant, the only German philosopher that he knew at that time, from translation, and he leaves a strong impression that, for him, as for Kant, the solution of these contradictions is beyond the human understanding. That is to say, that his understanding is incapable of solving them. But in spite of its alluring iconoclasticism, there is to be found, even in this first work, this contradiction that Proudhon, on one hand, deals with society from the point of view of the petty peasant, later of the petty bourgeois of France, and on the other he applies the standard which the socialists have transmitted to him. Beyond that, the very title of the book indicates its insufficiency. The question was too badly put for it to be answered correctly. Greco-Roman property was replaced by feudal property, and that by bourgeois property. History itself conveys the criticism of the conditions of property in the past. The question with which Proudhon had to deal was as to the relations of modern bourgeois property. To the question, what were these relations? One could only reply by a critical analysis of political economy, embracing the whole of the relations of property, not in their juridical expression as relations of will, but in their real form as relation of material production. As Proudhon subordinated the whole of these economic relations to the juridical notion of property, he could not go beyond the response which had been already given by Brissot before 1789, and in the same terms, property is robbery. Footnote. Brissot de Warville, Recherche sur le droit de propriété et sur le vol, etc. Berlin, 1782. In the 6th volume of the Bibliothèque du Législateur by Brissot de Warville. End of footnote. The conclusion to be drawn from all this is that the juridical notions of the bourgeoisie on robbery apply as well to its honest profits. On the other hand, as robbery being a violation of property presupposes property, Proudhon embroils himself in all kinds of confused and fantastic notions with regard to true bourgeois property. During my stay in Paris in 1844, I had personal relations with Proudhon. I recall this circumstance because up to a certain point I am responsible for his sophistication, a word which the English use for the adulteration of a commodity. In our long discussions, often lasting all through the night, I infected him with Hegelianism, to his great prejudice, since, not knowing German, he could not study the matter thoroughly. What I had begun, Mr. Karl Grun, after my expulsion from France, continued. But this professor of German philosophy had the further advantage over me of understanding nothing of what he taught. A short time before the publication of his second important work, Philosophie de la Misère, etc., Proudhon informed me of it in a long detailed letter, in which among other things he said, quote, "I await the blow of your critical rod," end quote. And very soon this fell upon him, in my Misère de la Philosophie, in such a fashion as to forever shatter our friendship. From the foregoing you can see that the Philosophie de la Misère, ou Système des Contradictions économiques, ought, in short, to give the answer to the question, what is property? As a matter of fact, Proudhon did not begin his economic studies until after the publication of this first book. He then discovered that in order to solve the question he had put, it was necessary to reply not by invective, but by an analysis of modern political economy. At the same time, he endeavored to establish the system of economic categories by means of dialectic. Hegelian contradiction had to replace the insoluble contradiction of Kant as a means of development. For a criticism of these two large volumes, I must refer you to my reply. I have there, among other things, shown how slightly Proudhon has penetrated the mystery of scientific dialectic, and how far, on the other hand, he shares the illusions of speculative philosophy. Instead of regarding the economic categories as the theoretical expressions of the historical relations of production corresponding to a given degree of the development of material production, his imagination transforms them into eternal ideas, existing before any reality, and in this manner he arrives in a roundabout way at the point from which he started, the point of view of bourgeois economy. Footnote. In saying that existing conditions, the conditions of bourgeois production, are natural, the economists give it to be understood that these are the relations in which wealth is created and the productive forces are developed conformably to the laws of nature. Thus these relations are themselves natural laws, independent of the influence of time. They are eternal laws which must always govern society. Thus there has been history, but there is no longer any. End of footnote. Then I show how defective and rudimentary is his knowledge of political economy, of which nevertheless he undertakes the criticism, and how, with the Utopians, he sets himself to seek for a pretended science which may furnish him with a ready-made formula for the solution of the social question, instead of drawing his science from critical knowledge of the historical movement, the movement which must itself produce the material conditions of social emancipation. What I, above all, denounce is that Mr. Proudhon has only imperfect ideas, confused and false, with regard to the basis of all political economy, exchange value, a circumstance which leads him to see the foundation of a new science in a Utopian interpretation of the theory of Ricardo. Finally, I sum up my judgment of his point of view in these words. Each economic relation has a good and bad side. That is the single point upon which Mr. Proudhon does not contradict himself. The good side he sees explained by the economists. The bad side he sees denounced by the socialists. He borrows from the economists the necessity of eternal relations. He borrowed from the socialists the illusion of seeing in poverty only poverty. He is in agreement with both in wishing to refer it to the authority of science. Science for him is reduced to the insignificant proportions of a scientific formula. It is thus that Mr. Proudhon flatters himself to have made the criticism of both political economy and of communism. He is below both the one and the other. Below the economists, since as a philosopher who has under his hand a magic formula, he has believed himself able to do without entering into purely economic details. Below the socialists, since he has neither sufficient courage nor sufficient intelligence to raise himself, were it only speculatively, above the bourgeois horizon. He wished to soar as a man of science above the bourgeoisie and the proletarians. He is only the petty bourgeois, tossed about constantly between capital and labor, between political economy and communism. However severe this judgment may appear, I am obliged still to maintain it word for word. But it is important to remember that at the time when I declared and proved theoretically that Proudhon's book was only the code of petty bourgeois socialism, this same Proudhon was being anathematized as an arch-revolutionist by the economists and the socialists of the period. That is the reason why I did not, at a later period, raise my voice with those who cried out about his betrayal of the revolution. It was not his fault if, at first ill understood by others as well as by himself, he has not fulfilled the hopes which nothing had ever justified. The Philosophie de la Misère was compared with Qu'est-ce que la propriété, displays very unfavorably all the defects of Proudhon's manner of exposition. The style is often what the French call bombastic, a pretentious and speculative piece of fustian, which represented as German philosophy presents itself everywhere where Gallic perspicacity is at fault. That which he trumpets in your ears, with the voice of a blustering buffoon, is his own glorification, wearisome nonsense, an eternal rhodomontade about his pretended science. Instead of the true and natural warmth which illumines his first book, in this Proudhon declaims systematically and fails to excite any feeling. Add to this the awkward and disagreeable didactic pedantry, which serves for erudition, of the man who has lost his former pride of being an independent and original thinker, and who now, as a parvenu of science, thinks he should swagger and boast of what he is not and of what he does not possess. After that, his sentiments of a tallow chandler, which lead him to attack in a most unseemly and brutal manner, but which is neither discerning nor profound, nor even just. A man like Cabet, who is always worthy of respect because of his political role in the midst of the proletariat, while he does the amiable towards a Dunoyer, a councillor of the state, it is true, who has no importance beyond that of having preached, with a comical seriousness, throughout the whole of 3 great volumes, insupportably tiresome, a hypercriticism thus described by Helvetius. Quote, "We desire that the unfortunate should be perfect." End quote. In fact, the Revolution of February happened very unfortunately for Proudhon, who, a few weeks previously, had proved definitely and irrefutably that the era of revolutions was past forever. Nevertheless, his attitude in the National Assembly merits nothing but praise, although it proved his lack of intelligence of the situation. After the insurrection of June, this attitude was an act of great courage. It had further this happy result, that Mr. Thiers, in his reply to the propositions of Proudhon, which was afterwards published as a book, revealed the mean, petty pedestal upon which the intellectual pillar of the French bourgeoisie was raised. Compared with Thiers, Proudhon assumed the proportions of an ancient colossus. The last economic acts and achievements of Proudhon were his discovery of free credit and the People's Bank, which should realize it. In my work, Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Criticism of Political Economy, Berlin 1859, pages 59 to 64, you will find the proof that these Proudhonian ideas are based upon a complete ignorance of the first elements of bourgeois political economy, the relation between commodity and money, while their practical realization was nothing but the reproduction of better elaborated projects of a much earlier period. There is no doubt, there is indeed evidence to show, that the development of credit, which has served in England in the beginning of the 18th century, and more recently in this, to transfer wealth from one class to another, might also serve, in certain political and economic conditions, to accelerate the emancipation of the working class. But to consider interest-bearing capital as the principal form of capital, and to wish to make of a particular application of credit the pretended abolition of the rate of interest, to think to make that the basis of the social transformation, that was indeed a petty chandler's fantasy. Moreover, we find that had been already elaborated con amore among the spokesmen of the small shopkeeping class of England in the 17th century, the polemic of Proudhon against Bastiat, with reference to interest-bearing capital, 1850, is far below his Philosophie de la Misère. He succeeds in allowing himself to be beaten even by Bastiat, and cries and blusters every time that his adversary deals him a blow. Some years ago, Proudhon wrote a thesis on imposts, published in opposition to my theories by the government of the canton of Vaud. In that work was extinguished the last ray of genius. Nothing of him remains but the petty bourgeois, pure and simple. The political and philosophical writings of Proudhon have all the same dual and contradictory character which we have found in his economic work. Besides, they have only a local importance, limited to France. His attacks upon the religion and the church had always a great local value in a period when the French socialists boasted of their religious sentiments as of something superior to the Voltairianism of the 18th century and the German atheism of the 19th. If Peter the Great overthrew Russian barbarism by barbarity, Proudhon did his best to overthrow French commonplace by commonplaces. The works which cannot be regarded merely as bad writings, but are simply vile trash, which, however, were quite in keeping with the petty chandler sentiment, were his book on the coup d'etat, in which he coquettes with Louis Bonaparte, and endeavors to make him acceptable to the French workman, and that against Poland, which in honor of the Tsar he treats with the cynicism of an idiot. Proudhon has often been compared to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Nothing could be more erroneous. He resembles rather Nicolas Linguet, whose Théorie des lois civiles is moreover a work of genius. The nature of Proudhon leads him to dialectics, but having never comprehended scientific dialectic, he gets no further than sophistry. In fact, that arises from his petty bourgeois point of view. The petty bourgeois, precisely like our own historian Raumer, always speaks of one side and of the other side. Two opposing contradictory currents dominate his material interests, and in consequence his religious, scientific, and artistic views, his morality, and in fact his whole being. If he is besides, like Proudhon, a man of intellect, he will very soon be able to juggle with his own contradictions, and to elaborate them in striking, noisy, if sometimes brilliant, paradoxes. Scientific charlatanism and political compromises are inseparable from such a point of view. There is, in such case, only a single motive, individual vanity, and as with all vain people, there is no question of anything beyond the mere effect of the moment, the success of the hour. In this is necessarily lost the simple moral tact which would preserve a Rousseau, for example, from all compromise, even apparent, with the powers that be. Perhaps posterity will say, to distinguish this most recent phase of French history, that Louis Bonaparte was its Napoleon, and Proudhon its Rousseau-Voltaire. Yours, etc., Karl Marx. Appendix 2, footnote. Extract from Marx's work Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Berlin, 1859, pages 61 to 64. End of footnote. The theory of labor time as the unity of direct measure of money was developed in a systematic manner for the first time by John Gray. Footnote. John Gray, quote, The Social System, etc., Treatise on the Principle of Exchange. Edinburgh, 1831, composed by the same author. Lectures on the Nature and Use of Money. Edinburgh, 1848. After the Revolution of February, Gray sent to the Provisional Government a memorial in which he informed them that it was not the organization of labor which France needed, but an organization of exchange, a completely elaborated plan of which was to be found in the system of money which he had discovered. The worthy John never imagined that 16 years later, after the publication of his social system, a patent would be taken out for the same discovery by Proudhon, that genius so fertile in invention. End of footnote. A central national bank, by the aid of its branches, would certify the time employed in the production of different commodities. In exchange for his commodity, the producer would receive an official certificate of its value. That is to say, a receipt for the labor time contained in his commodity. Footnote. Gray, The Social System, etc., page 63. Quote, money should be merely a receipt, an evidence that the holder of it has either contributed certain value to the national stock of wealth, or that he has acquired a right to the same value from someone who has contributed to it. End quote. End of footnote. And these notes of a week of labor, a day of labor, an hour of labor, would represent the equivalent which the holder could receive of any other commodities which were in the stores of the bank. Footnote. Quote, an estimated value being previously put upon produce, let it be lodged in a bank, and drawn out again, whenever it is required, merely stipulating, by common consent, that he who lodges any kind of property in the proposed national bank may take out of it an equal value of whatever it may contain, instead of being obliged to draw out the self-same thing that he put in. End quote. Ibid, page 68. End of footnote. That is the fundamental principle which he has carefully assumed, developed in all its details, based upon existing English institutions. With this system, says Gray, quote, it would be as easy to sell for money as it is now to buy with money. Production would be the uniform and inexhaustible source of the demand. End quote. Ibid, page 16. The precious metals would lose the privilege which they have over the other commodities, and, quote, would take the place which belongs to them on the market side by side with butter, eggs, cloth, and calico, and their value would interest us no more than that of diamonds. End quote. Footnote. Gray, Lectures on Money, etc., page 180. Ought we to retain our artificial measure of value, gold, and fetter, thus the productive forces of the country, or ought we not rather to make use of the natural measure of value, labor, and liberate the productive forces? Ibid, page 169. Since labor time is the actual measure of value, why by the side of it should there be another, extrinsic value? Why should exchange value be transformed into price? Why do all commodities estimate their value in a single commodity, money, which thus becomes equal to the value of exchange? That was the problem which Gray had to solve. Instead of solving it, he imagines that commodities can assort themselves, in direct relation with each other, as the products of social labor. But they cannot assort themselves in relation to each other otherwise than as they are. Commodities are the immediate products of individual labors, independent and isolated, which can express themselves as general social labor only by changing themselves in the process of individual exchange. Labor, in the production of commodities, only becomes social labor by losing its character of individual labor. In representing the labor time contained in commodities as labor time directly social, Gray represents it as collective labor, or as the labor time of individuals directly associated. In such conditions, as a matter of fact, a specific commodity such as gold or silver could not be for the other commodities the incarnation of labor in general. Value in exchange would not become price, but neither would use value become value in exchange. The product would not become a commodity, and thus would disappear the basis upon which bourgeois production rests. But that is not the idea of Gray. The products must be produced as commodities, but they must not be exchanged as commodities. Gray confides to a national bank the execution of this pious desire. On one side, society, by the intermediary of the national bank, renders the individuals independent of the conditions of individual exchange, and on the other side, it leaves them to continue to produce on the basis of individual exchange. Logic compels Gray to successively deny all the conditions of bourgeois production, although he desires merely to reform money, the consequence of the exchange of commodities. He transforms capital into national capital. Footnote: the business of every country ought to be conducted on a national capital. John Gray, The Social System, page 71. Property in land into national land. Footnote: the land to be transformed into national property. Ibid, page 298. End of footnote. And when we look more closely into it, we see that he does not receive in one hand the commodities and deliver with the other certificates for labor received, but that he regulates production itself. In his last work, Lectures on Money, in which Gray sets himself to present his labor money as a purely bourgeois reform, he loses himself in still more transparent absurdities. Every commodity is money. That is Gray's theory, and this is the result of his incomplete and therefore mistaken analysis of commodities. The organic construction of labor money and the national bank and the stores of commodities is only a dream in which we are enabled to get a glimpse of the dogma as a universal law. The dogma that a commodity is money, or that the labor of an individual contained in it is social labor, does not become a truth simply because a bank believes in it and acts upon it. Failure in this case plays the part of practical criticism. What Gray has not said, and what he has not imagined, that is to say, that labor money is an alluring economic phrase for those who have a pious desire to dispense with the use of money, with the value of exchange of commodities, with the commodities of bourgeois society, has been loudly proclaimed by the English socialists who have written before and since himself. Footnote: for instance, B.W. Thompson's An Inquiry into the Distribution of Wealth, etc., London, 1827, Bray, Labor's Wrongs and Labor's Remedy, Leeds, 1839. But it was reserved for Proudhon and his school to seriously proclaim the degradation of money and the exaltation of commodities as the principle of socialism, and therefore to reduce socialism to an elementary misconception of the necessary dependence which exists between commodity and money. Footnote: as a compendium of his melodramatic theory of money may be cited the work of Mr. Alfred Derimont, De la Réforme des Banques, Paris, 1856. Appendix 3. 1. Free Trade. Footnote: the speech on free exchange by Marx is reproduced textually from the original pamphlet published in Brussels in 1848, and which has become so rare that we know of no other copy than that of Engels, from which the German, English, Italian, and Russian translations, which appeared later, have been made. Note by the editor of the French edition, 1896. End of footnote. A speech delivered before the Democratic Association of Brussels, at its public meeting, January 9th, 1848, by Karl Marx. Gentlemen, the repeal of the Corn Laws in England is the greatest triumph of free trade in the 19th century. In every country where manufacturers speak of free trade, they have in mind chiefly free trade in corn or raw material generally. To burden foreign corn with protective duties is infamous. It is to speculate on the hunger of the people. Cheap food, high wages, for this alone the English free traders have spent millions, and their enthusiasm has already infected their continental brethren. And generally speaking, all those who advocate free trade do so in the interests of the working class. But, strange to say, the people for whom cheap food is to be procured at all costs are very ungrateful. Cheap food has a bad repute in England as cheap government has in France. The people see in these self-sacrificing gentlemen, in Bowring, Bright, and Co., their worst enemies, and the most shameless hypocrites. Everyone knows that in England the struggle between Liberals and Democrats takes the name of the struggle between free traders and Chartists. Let us see how the English free traders have proved to the people the good intentions that animate them. That is what they said to the factory hands. Quote, the duty on corn is a tax upon wages. This tax you pay to the landlords, those medieval aristocrats. If your position is a wretched one, it is so only on account of the high price of the most indispensable articles of food. End quote. The workers in turn asked of the manufacturers, quote, how is it that, in the course of the last 30 years, while our commerce and manufacture has immensely increased, our wages have fallen far more rapidly, in proportion, than the price of corn has gone up?
The tax which you say we pay the landlords is scarcely 3 pence a week per worker, and yet the wages on the hand-loom weaver fell between 1815 and 1843 from 28 sous per week to 5 sous, and the wages of the power-loom weavers between 1823 and 1843 from 20 sous per week to 8 sous. And during the whole of that time the portion of the tax which you say we pay to the landlord has never exceeded 3 pence. And then, in the year 1834, when tell us? You said, if you are poor, it is only because you tell us. You said, if you are poor, it is only because you have too many children, and your marriages are more productive than your labor. These are the very words you spoke to us, and you set about making new poor laws, and building workhouses, those bastilles of the proletariat. To this manufacturers replied, quote, you are right, worthy laborers. It is not the price of corn alone, but competition of the hands among themselves as well, which determine wages. But just bear in mind the circumstances that our soil consists of nothing but rock and sandbanks. You surely do not imagine that corn can be grown in flower pots. Therefore, if, instead of wasting our labor and capital upon a thoroughly sterile soil, we were to give up agriculture and devote ourselves exclusively to commerce and manufacture, all Europe would abandon its factories, and England would form one huge factory town, with the whole of the rest of Europe for its agricultural districts. While thus haranguing his own working men, the manufacturer is interrogated by the small tradesmen, who exclaim, quote, if we repeal the corn laws, we shall indeed ruin agriculture, but, for all that, we shall not compel other nations to give up their own factories and buy our goods. What will the consequences be? I lose my customers in the country, and the home market is destroyed. The manufacturer turns his back upon the working men and replies to the shopkeeper, quote, as to that, you leave it to us. Once rid of the duty on corn, we shall import cheaper corn from abroad. Then we shall reduce wages at the very time when they are rising in the countries where we get our corn. Thus, in addition to the advantages which we already enjoy, we shall have lower wages, and with all these advantages we shall easily force the continent to buy of us. But now the farmers and agricultural laborers join in the discussion. Quote, and what, pray, is to become of us? Are we to help in passing a sentence of death upon agriculture when we get our living by it? Are we to let the soil be torn from beneath our feet? For all answer, the Anti-Corn Law League contented itself with offering prizes for the 3 best essays upon the wholesome influence of the repeal of the corn laws on English agriculture. These prizes were carried off by Messrs. Hope, Morse, and Gregg, whose essays were distributed by thousands throughout the agricultural districts. One of the prize essayists devotes himself to proving that neither the tenant farmer nor the agricultural laborer would lose by the repeal of the corn laws, and that the landlord alone would lose. Quote, the English tenant farmer, he exclaims, need not fear repeal, because no other country can produce such good corn so cheaply as England. Thus, even if the price of corn fell, it would not hurt you, because this fall would only affect rent, which would go down, while the profit of capital and the wages of labor would remain stationary. The second prize essayist, Mr. Morse, maintains, on the contrary, that the price of corn will rise in consequence of repeal. He is at infinite pains to prove that protective duties have never been able to secure a remunerative price for corn. In support of his assertion, he quotes the fact that, whenever foreign corn has been imported, the price of corn in England has gone up considerably, and that when little corn has been imported, the price is falling greatly. This prize winner forgets that the importation was not the cause of the high price, but that the high price was the cause of the importation. In direct contradiction of his colleague, he asserts that every rise in the price of corn is profitable to both the tenant farmer and laborer, but does not benefit the landlord. The third prize essayist, Mr. Gregg, who is a large manufacturer, and whose work is addressed to the large tenant farmers, could not afford to echo such silly stuff. His language is more scientific. He admits that the corn laws can increase rent only by increasing the price of corn, and that they can raise the price of corn only by inducing the investment of capital upon land of inferior quality, and this is a perfectly natural explanation. In proportion as population increases, it inevitably follows, if foreign corn cannot be imported, that less fruitful soil must be called into requisition, the cultivation of which involves more expense, and the product of which is consequently dearer. There being a demand for all the corn thus produced, it will all be sold. The price for all of it will of necessity be determined by the price of the product of the inferior soil. The difference between this price and the cost of production upon soil of better quality constitutes the rent paid for the use of the better soil. If, therefore, in consequence of the repeal of the corn laws, the price of corn falls, and if, as a matter of course, rent falls with it, it is because inferior soil will no longer be cultivated. Thus the reduction of rent must inevitably ruin a number of the tenant farmers. These remarks are necessary in order to make Mr. Gregg's language comprehensible. Quote, "The small farmers," he says, "who cannot support themselves by agriculture, must take refuge in manufacture. As to the large tenant farmers, they cannot fail to profit by the arrangement. Either the landlord will be obliged to sell them their land very cheap, or leases will be made out for very long periods. This will enable tenant farmers to invest more capital in their farms, to use agricultural machinery on a larger scale, and to save manual labor, which will, moreover, be cheaper, on account of the general fall in wages, the immediate consequence of the repeal of the corn laws." End quote. Dr. Bowring conferred upon all these arguments the consecration of religion by exclaiming at the public meeting, quote, "Jesus Christ is free trade, and free trade is Jesus Christ." End quote. It may be easily understood that all this cant was not calculated to make cheap bread tasteful to working men. Besides, how should the working men understand the sudden philanthropy of the manufacturers, the very men who were still busy fighting against the 10 hours bill, which was to reduce the working day of the mill hands from 12 hours to 10. To give you an idea of the philanthropy of these manufacturers, I would remind you of the factory regulations in force in all their mills. Every manufacturer has for his own special use a regular penal code by means of which fines are inflicted for every voluntary or involuntary offense. For instance, the operative pays so much when he has the misfortune to sit down on a chair, or whisper, or speak, or laugh, if he is a few moments late, if any part of a machine breaks, or if he turns out work of an inferior quality, etc. The fines are always greater than the damage really done by the workman, and to give the working man every opportunity for incurring fines, the factory clock is set forward, and he is given bad material to make into good stuff. An overseer unskillful in multiplying infractions of rules is soon discharged. You see, gentlemen, this private legislation is enacted for the especial purpose of creating such infractions, and infractions are manufactured for the purpose of making money. Thus the manufacturer uses every means of reducing the nominal wage, and even profiting by accidents over which the workers have no control. And these manufacturers are the same philanthropists who have tried to persuade the workers that they were capable of going to immense expense for the sole and express purpose of improving the condition of those same working men. On the one hand, they nibble at the workers' wages in the meanest way by means of factory regulations, and, on the other, they are prepared to make the greatest sacrifices to raise those wages by means of the Anti-Corn Law League. They build great palaces at immense expense, in which the League takes up its official residence. They send an army of missionaries to all corners of England to preach the gospel of free trade. They print and distribute gratis thousands of pamphlets to enlighten the working man upon his own interests. They spend enormous sums to buy over the press to their side. They organize a vast administrative system for the conduct of the free trade movement, and bestow all the wealth of their eloquence upon public meetings. It was at one of these meetings that a working man exclaimed boldly, quote, "If the landlords were to sell our bones, you manufacturers would be the first to buy them, and to put them through the mill and make flour of them." End quote. The English working men have appreciated to the fullest extent the significance of the struggle between the lords of the land and of capital. They know very well that the price of bread was to be reduced in order to reduce wages, and that the profit of capital would rise in proportion as rent fell. Ricardo, the apostle of the English free traders, the leading economist of our century, entirely agrees with the workers upon this point. In his celebrated work upon political economy, he says, quote, "If instead of growing our own corn, we discover a new market from which we can supply ourselves at a cheaper price, wages will fall and profits rise. The fall in the price of agricultural produce reduces the wages, not only of the labor employed in cultivating the soil, but also of all those employed in commerce or manufacture." End quote. And do not believe, gentlemen, that it is the matter of indifference to the working man whether he receives only 4 francs on account of corn being cheaper when he has received 5 francs before. Have not his wages always fallen in comparison with profit? And is it not clear that his social position has grown worse as compared with that of the capitalist, beside which he loses actually? So long as the price of corn was higher and wages were also higher, a small saving in the consumption of bread sufficed to procure him other enjoyments. But as soon as bread is cheap and wages are therefore low, he can save almost nothing on bread for the purchase of other articles. The English working men have shown the English free traders that they are not the dupes of their illusions or of their lies, and if, in spite of this, the workers have made common cause with the manufacturers against the landlords, it is for the purpose of destroying the last remnant of feudalism, that, henceforth, they may have only one enemy to deal with. The workers have not miscalculated, for the landlords, in order to revenge themselves upon the manufacturers, have made common cause with the workers to carry the 10 hours bill, which the latter has been vainly demanding for 30 years, and which was passed immediately after the repeal of the Corn Laws. Dr. Bowring at the Congress of Economists drew from his pocket a long list to show how many head of cattle, how much ham, bacon, poultry, etc., is imported into England, to be consumed, as he asserted, by the workers. He unfortunately forgot to state that at the same time the workers of Manchester and other factory towns were thrown out of work by the beginning of the crisis. As a matter of principle in political economy, the figures of a single year must never be taken as the basis for formulating general laws. We must always take the average from 6 to 7 years, a period during which modern industry passes through the successive phases of prosperity, overproduction, crisis, thus completing the inevitable cycle. Doubtless, if the price of all commodities falls, and this is the necessary consequence of free trade, I can buy far more for a franc than before, and the working man's franc is as good as any other man's. Therefore, free trade must be advantageous to the working man. There is only one little difficulty in this, namely that the workman, before he exchanges his franc for other commodities, has first exchanged his labor for the money of the capitalist. If in this exchange he always receives the said franc, while the price of the other commodities fell, he would always be the gainer by such a bargain. The difficulty does not lie in proving that, the price of all commodities falling, more commodities can be bought for the same sum of money. Economists always take the price of labor at the moment of its exchange with other commodities, and altogether ignore the moment at which labor accomplishes its own exchange with capital, when it costs less to set in motion the machinery which produces commodities, then the things necessary for the maintenance of this machine, called workmen, will also cost less. If all commodities are cheaper, labor, which is a commodity too, will also fall in price, and we shall see later that this commodity, labor, will fall far lower in proportion than all other commodities. If the working man still pins his faith to the arguments of the economists, he will find, one fine morning, that the franc has dwindled in his pocket, and that he has only 5 sous left. Thereupon the economist will tell you, quote, "We admit that competition among the workers will certainly not be lessened under free trade, and will very soon bring wages into harmony with the low price of commodities. But, on the other hand, the low price of commodities will increase consumption. The larger consumption will increase production, which will in turn necessitate a larger demand for labor, and this larger demand will be followed by a rise in wages." Quote, "The whole argument amounts to this: free trade increases productive forces. When manufactures keep advancing, when the productive forces, when, in a word, productive capital increases, the demand for labor, the price of labor, and consequently the rate of wages rise also." End quote. The most favorable condition for the working man is the growth of capital. This must be admitted. When capital remains stationary, commerce and manufacture are not merely stationary, but decline, and in this case, the workman is the first victim. He will suffer before the capitalist, and in the case of the growth of capital under the circumstances which, as we have said, are the best for the working man, what will be his lot? He will suffer just the same. The growth of capital implies the accumulation and the concentration of capital. The centralization involves a greater division of labor and a greater use of machinery. The greater division of labor destroys the especial skill of the laborer, and by putting in the place of this skilled work labor which anyone can perform, it increases competition among the workers. This competition becomes more fierce as the division of labor enables a single man to do the work of three. Machinery accomplishes the same result on a much larger scale. The accumulation of productive capital forces the industrial capitalist to work with constantly increasing means of production, ruins the small manufacturer, and throws him into the ranks of the proletariat. Then, the rate of interest falling in proportion as capital accumulates, the people of small means and retired tradespeople who can no longer live upon their small incomes will be forced to look out for some business again, and ultimately to swell the number of proletarians. Finally, the more productive capital grows, the more it is compelled to produce for a market whose requirements it does not know. The more supply tries to force demand, and consequently, crisis increases in frequency and in intensity. But every crisis in turn hastens the concentration of capital, adds to the proletariat. Thus, as productive capital grows, competition among the workers grows too, and grows in a far greater proportion. The reward of labor is less for all, and the burden of labor is increased for at least some of them. In 1829 there were, in Manchester, 1,088 cotton spinners employed in 36 factories. In 1841 there were but 448, and they tended 55,353 more spindles than the 1,088 spinners did in 1829. If manual labor had increased in the same proportion as productive force, the number of spinners ought to have risen to 1,848. Improved machinery had, therefore, deprived 1,100 workers of employment. We know beforehand the reply of the economists. The people thus thrown out of work will find other kinds of employment. Dr. Bowring did not fail to reproduce this argument at the Congress of Economists, but neither did he fail to refute himself. In 1833, Dr. Bowring made a speech in the House of Commons upon the 50,000 hand-loom weavers of London, who have been starving without being able to find that new kind of employment which the free traders hold out to them in the distance. I will give the most striking portion of the speech of Mr. Bowring. Quote, "The misery of the hand-loom weavers," he says, "is the inevitable fate of all kinds of labor which are easily acquired, and which may at any moment be replaced by less costly means. As in these cases competition amongst the workpeople is very great, the slightest falling off in demand brings on a crisis. The hand-loom weavers are, in a certain sense, placed on the verge of human existence. One step further, and that existence becomes impossible. The slightest shock is sufficient to throw them on the road to ruin. By more and more superseding manual labor, the progress of mechanical science must result, during the period of transition, in much temporary suffering. National well-being cannot be bought except at the price of some individual evils. The advance of industry is achieved at the expense of those who lag behind, and of all discoveries that of the power-loom weighs most heavily upon the hand-loom weavers. In a great many articles formerly made by hand, the weaver has been completely ousted, but he is sure to be beaten in a good many more stuffs that are now made by hand." Further on he says, quote, "I hold in my hand a correspondence of the Governor-General with the East India Company. This correspondence is concerning the weavers of the Dhaka district. The Governor says in his letter, 'A few years ago the East India Company received from 6 to 8 million pieces of calico woven upon the looms of the country. The demand fell off gradually and was reduced to about 1 million pieces. At this moment it has almost entirely ceased. Moreover, in 1800, North America received from India nearly 800,000 pieces of cotton goods. In 1830 it did not take even 4,000. Finally, in 1800, 1,000,000 pieces were shipped to Portugal. In 1830, Portugal did not receive above 20,000. The reports on the distress of the Indian weavers are terrible. And what is the origin of that distress? The presence on the market of English manufactures, the production of the same article by means of the power loom. A great number of the weavers died of starvation. The remainder has gone over to other employment, and chiefly to field labor. Not to be able to change employment amounted to a sentence of death. And at this moment the Dhaka district is crammed with English yarns and piece goods. The Dhaka muslin, renowned all over the world for its beauty and firm texture, has also been eclipsed by the competition of English machinery. In the whole history of commerce, it would, perhaps, be difficult to find suffering equal to what these whole classes in India had to submit to." Mr. Bowring's speech is the more remarkable because the facts quoted by him are correct, and the phrases with which he seeks to palliate them are characterized by the hypocrisy common to all free trade discourses. He represents the workers as means of production which must be superseded by less expensive means of production, pretends to see in the labor of which he speaks a wholly exceptional kind of labor, and in the machine which has crushed out the weavers an equally exceptional kind of machine. He forgets that there is no kind of manual labor which may not any day share the fate of the handloom weavers. Quote, "The constant aim and tendency of every improvement of mechanism is indeed to do entirely without the labor of men, or to reduce its price, by superseding the labor of the adult males by that of women and children, or the work of the skilled by that of the unskilled workmen. In most of the throstle mills, spinning is now entirely done by girls of 16 years and less. The introduction of the self-acting mule has caused the discharge of most of the adult male spinners, while the children and young persons have been kept on." The above words of the most enthusiastic of free traders, Dr. Urey, are calculated to complete the confessions of Dr. Bowring. Mr. Bowring speaks of certain individual evils and, at the same time, says that these individual evils destroy whole classes. He speaks of the temporary sufferings during a transition period, and does not deny that these temporary evils have implied for the majority the transition from life to death, and for the rest a transition from a better to a worse condition. When he asserts, farther on, that the sufferings of the working class are inseparable from the progress of industry, and are necessary to the prosperity of the nation, he simply says that the prosperity of the bourgeois class involves, as a necessary condition, the suffering of the laboring class. All the comfort which Mr. Bowring offers the workers who perish, and, indeed, the whole doctrine of compensation which the free traders propound, amounts to this: you thousands of workers who are perishing, do not despair. You can die with an easy conscience. Your class will not perish. It will always be numerous enough for the capitalist class to decimate it without fear of annihilating it. Besides, how could capital be usefully applied if it did not take care to keep up its exploitable material, i.e., the workingman, to be exploited over and over again? But then, why propound as a problem still to be solved the question, what influence will the adoption of free trade have upon the condition of the working class? All the laws formulated by the political economists from Quesnay to Ricardo have been based upon the hypothesis that the trammels, which still interfere with commercial freedom, have disappeared. These laws are confirmed in proportion as free trade is adopted. The first of these laws is that competition reduces the price of every commodity to the minimum cost of production. Thus the minimum wage is the natural price of labor. And what is the minimum of wages? Just so much as is required for production of the articles absolutely necessary for the maintenance of the worker, and for the continued existence, more or less poorly, of his class. But do not imagine that the worker receives only this minimum wage, and still less that he always receives it. No, according to this law, the working class will sometimes be more fortunate, will sometimes receive something above the minimum, but this surplus will merely make up for the deficit which they will have received below the minimum in times of industrial depression. That is to say that within a given time, which recurs periodically in the cycle, which commerce and industry describe, while passing through the successive phases of prosperity, overproduction, stagnation, and crisis, when reckoning all that the working class has had above and below mere necessaries, we shall see that, after all, they have received neither more nor less than the minimum, i.e., the working class will have maintained itself as a class after enduring any amount of misery and misfortune, and after leaving many corpses upon the industrial battlefield. But what of it? The class will still exist, nay, more, it will have increased. But this is not all. The progress of industry creates less and less expensive means of subsistence. Thus spirits have taken the place of beer, cotton that of wool and linen, and potatoes that of bread. Thus, as means are constantly being found for the maintenance of labor on cheaper and more wretched food, the minimum of wages is constantly sinking. If these wages began by letting the man work to live, they end by forcing him to live the life of a machine. His existence has no other value than that of simple productive force, and the capitalist treats him accordingly. This law of the commodity labor, of the minimum of wages, will be confirmed in proportion as the supposition of the economists, free trade, becomes an actual fact. Thus, of two things one. Either we must reject all political economy based upon the assumption of free trade, or we must admit that under the same free trade, the whole severity of the economic laws will fall upon the worker. To sum up, what is free trade under the present conditions of society? Freedom of capital. When you have torn down the few national barriers which still restrict the free development of capital, you will merely have given it complete freedom of action. So long as the relation of wage labor to capital is permitted to exist, no matter how favorable the conditions under which you accomplish the exchange of commodities, there will always be a class which exploits and a class which is exploited. It is really difficult to understand the presumption of the free traders, who imagine that the more advantageous application of capital will abolish the antagonism between industrial capitalists and wage workers. On the contrary, the only result will be that the antagonism of these two classes will stand out more clearly. Let us assume for a moment that there are no more corn laws or national and municipal import duties. That in a world all the accidental circumstances which today the working man may look upon as a cause of his miserable condition have vanished, and we shall have removed so many curtains that hide from his eyes his real enemy. He will see that capital released from all trammels will make him no less a slave than capital trammeled by import duties. Gentlemen, do not be deluded by the abstract word liberty. Whose liberty? Not the liberty of one individual in relation to another, but the liberty of capital to crush the worker. Why should you desire farther to sanction unlimited competition with this idea of freedom, when the idea of freedom itself is only the product of a social condition based upon free competition? We have shown what sort of fraternity free trade begets between the different classes of one and the same nation. The fraternity which free trade would establish between the nations of the earth would not be more real. To call cosmopolitan exploitation universal brotherhood is an idea that could only be engendered in the brain of the bourgeoisie. Every one of the destructive phenomena which unlimited competition gives rise to within any one nation is reproduced in more gigantic proportions in the market of the world. We need not pause any longer upon free trade sophisms on this subject, which are worth just as much as the arguments of our prize essayists, Messrs. Hope, Morse, and Gregg. For instance, we are told that free trade would create an international division of labor, and thereby give to each country those branches of production most in harmony with its natural advantages. You believe, perhaps, gentlemen, that the production of coffee and sugar is the natural destiny of the West Indies. 2 centuries ago, nature, which does not trouble itself about commerce, had planted neither sugar cane nor coffee trees there, and it may be that in less than half a century you will find there neither coffee nor sugar, for the East Indies, by means of cheaper production, have already successfully broken down this so-called natural destiny of the West Indies. And the West Indies, with their natural wealth, are as heavy a burden for England as the weavers of Dhaka, who also were destined from the beginning of time to weave by hand. One other circumstance must not be forgotten, namely, that, just as everything has become a monopoly, there are also nowadays some branches of industry which prevail over all others, and secure to the nations which especially foster them the command of the world market. Thus, in the commerce of the world, cotton alone has much greater commercial importance than all the other raw materials used in the manufacture of clothing. It is indeed ridiculous for the free traders to refer to the few specialties in each branch of industry, throwing them into the scales against the products used in everyday consumption, and produced more cheaply in those countries in which manufacture is most highly developed. If the free traders cannot understand how one nation can grow rich at the expense of another, we need not wonder, since these same gentlemen also refuse to understand how in the same country one class can enrich itself at the expense of another. Do not imagine, gentlemen, that in criticizing freedom of commerce we have the least intention of defending protection. One may be opposed to constitutionalism without being in favor of absolutism. Moreover, the protective system is nothing but a means of establishing manufacture upon a large scale in any given country. That is to say, of making it dependent upon the market of the world, and from the moment that dependence upon the market of the world is established, there is more or less dependence upon free trade too. Besides this, the protective system helps to develop free competition within a nation. Hence, we see that in countries where the bourgeoisie is beginning to make itself felt as a class, in Germany for example, it makes great efforts to obtain protective duties. They serve the bourgeoisie as a weapon against feudalism and absolute monarchy, as a means for the concentration of its own powers for the realization of free trade within the country. But generally speaking, the free trade system is destructive. It breaks up old nationalities and carries the antagonism between proletariat and bourgeoisie to the uttermost point. In a word, the system of commercial freedom hastens the social revolution. In this revolutionary sense alone, gentlemen, I am in favor of free trade. The end.